So it's coming on. I have to remember to make sure that the sound is off on the YouTube. Otherwise we get an echo, especially when the video is on. Okay. Okay. It's much easier to do this once we have people on. So now let me share my screen. Actually, want to make sure that people can get in while we're doing the class. Okay. We are getting there. It's a very, very light class for the most part. It's more of a presentation. You'll be learning, you'll be hearing stories. No, one second, what did I just do? I shared the wrong thing. Okay, let me share the right thing. Okay, there we go. One more time. To remember to share the sound. And we're going to be ready to go in just a moment. There we go. No, I got to try one more time because I don't see you guys. So I got to make sure I can see my students. Ah, I know why. There we go. Amazing. Let's check that everything's moving. Okay. There we go. So I want to welcome Eddie, Susan, Julie, and Elaine. Thank you so much for joining us, and anybody else who is participating or will participate and watch this afterwards. Thank you for joining us. It's a special day today. It's a special day because it's the Rebbe's father's yahrzeit. And because the Rebbe means so much to us, his father, who was very dear to him, but because of the circumstances, as we'll learn tonight, his father passed away after an illness, after being sent to exile for about 5 years. And by that time, the Rebbe was already in the United States. And so unfortunately, the Rebbe was never able to even visit his father's grave back in what's today Ukraine. There is one story online of an individual who went to Russia as an American diplomat or for some kind of meetings, government meetings, and he was going to Kazakhstan. And the Rebbe asked him if he would be going to Alma-Ata, or Alma-Ati, some people call it, which is where his father was buried. And it meant so much to the Rebbe that someone was able to go on his behalf. But as we will see, the Rebbe's father was an incredible individual. And we will not only go into some of the stories of his self-sacrifice, which we will be able to learn from, but also his style of study of Torah, which he taught the Rebbe. This is not a class about the Rebbe, but the Rebbe was his student. In fact, when the Rebbe was very young, he had a teacher, and then he had another teacher. I guess he was going up in classes. They were trying to find teachers, and eventually, either there wasn't the class wasn't up to the Rebbe's grade level, or the teacher wasn't able to teach. The Rebbe was going too fast. It was too advanced at a very young age, and so he had no choice but to be homeschooled, and he was taught by his father. Okay, so let's go to his father's life a little bit. Who was his father? So the Rebbe's father, whose name was Reb Levi Yitzchak, was, which is, again, this is a picture of the Rebbe's father. I actually have to say that this was a picture that they only found maybe in the early 90s. There was a picture they had of the Rebbe's father, which, besides the shape of his face, did not look very much like him. And in fact, when the Rebbe saw that picture, the Rebbe said, I don't recognize him. He had gone through such terrible times in exile that his face had changed, and the Rebbe didn't recognize him. And when they were able to bring a picture, this picture obviously was found after the fall of communism, and this was the way the Rebbe's father actually looked. So growing up, we had a different picture of what the Rebbe's father looked like. And interesting that this date was always a special date growing up in London. So I like to make my class and my presentations a little personal. So growing up in London, this was always a very special day. And the reason why this was a special day was because one of the senior members of our community, who was the Torah reader in our community, his family actually lived in Almaty, which is the area where the Rebbe's father passed away. And they were very close with the Rebbe's father, not for very long. And they used to help him. He was very, very sick at that time. It was at the end of his exile. He was sent to a nearby Jewish community where at the time he was very, very sick, and they took care of him. And this was the Raskin family. My sister actually married his grandson. But he and his father, more specifically, and his brothers, they would help the Rebbe's father. In fact, and so every year on the Rebbe's father's yahrzeit, because he knew the Rebbe's father personally, so it was always a special time in our community, and people would tell stories of the Rebbe's father. So one story that I always heard, that's not on the script tonight, but is just a beautiful story about one of his brothers. It was the last, again, this was just right before the Rebbe's father passed away. The Rebbe's father passed away on the 20th of the month of Av. And we know we are only 11 days from Tisha B'Av, from the 9th of Av, which is the fast of Av, the day we mourn the destruction of the temple. That year, the 9th of Av was on a Shabbos, and so the fast day was Saturday night into Sunday. And the Rebbe's father was engaged in conversation that afternoon with one of his brothers, with one of this Rabbi Raskin or his brothers, and he kept him. And as the day went by, I believe the Rebbe's mother, so let's call him Reb Leivik, which is, his name was Reb Levi Yitzchak, and people knew him fondly as Reb Leivik. So Reb Leivik is engaged in conversation with his young boy. I don't know if he was a teenager or a young man at the time, a young boy. I'm just not sure which brother it was, but he kept him engaged in Torah thoughts, discussion. And Reb Leivik's wife, the Rebbe's mother, comes in and says, the fast is starting soon. It's almost dark, and you may want to stop to take something to eat before the fast. And so this young man also has to get something to eat. So he has to go home. And the Rebbe's father dismissed it, and he continued to speak. It became dark already, and he stopped speaking, and this young man headed home. By the time he got home, it was already Tisha B'Av. It was already after the fast had started, and he wasn't able to eat before the fast. When he got home, he walked into the house. His mother ran over to him and gave him the biggest hug and said, "Thank God, because he was delayed. While he was out, they used to go around and collect the youngsters to bring them into the army, into the Russian army. And had he been home at that moment, they would have taken him off to the army. And who knows what would have been with him. I believe the brother later, this particular brother was later the Chabad emissary, the Rebbe's emissary to Morocco, and accomplished a tremendous amount. But that was the Rebbe's father, who was an incredible individual. So tonight we will share a few little things about him. So first of all, the Rebbe was born, just to put it into context, in 1902. I believe they were living at the time in a city called Nikolaev. And so before I go to where they moved, and who was the Rebbe's father was actually a great grandson of the third Chabad Rebbe, Reb Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch. And being that it was his great grandfather, he was born the Rebbe's father was born maybe 12 years, I believe, after this third Rebbe passed away, his great grandfather. And his firstborn son, which was the Rebbe, he named after his great grandfather. Later, the Rebbe marries a distant cousin, who's also a great grandchild of this Rebbe. And that union, through that union, the Rebbe now becomes the Rebbe of Chabad Lubavitch. So that's the connection to the Schneerson dynasty. The Tzemach Tzedek was Reb Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch. His name was Schneerson because the first Chabad Rebbe's name was Schneer. So his grandchildren became Schneerson. His children, I believe, were Schneori, their last name, and the grandchildren became Schneerson. So he is a descendant of the Chabad rabbinic dynasty and the father of the Rebbe. And in 1909, he becomes the rabbi of the synagogue in Yekaterinslav. Today, the city of Yekaterinslav, I think that's if I'm saying it correctly. Today it's called, I don't know if anybody could say either name, but the name today it's called Dnepropetrovsk. That's the name of the city today. It's a huge city in Ukraine, Dnepropetrovsk. Some people call it Dnieper, just to say it in short. So this is actually the synagogue where the Rebbe's father served as rabbi. He served as rabbi there for 32 years. And for the last 18 years, he became the chief rabbi of the city, and he was well respected throughout the region. People from all over would come to ask him questions. Many people, especially those who had accepted the lifestyle and the Russian lifestyle and the ways of communism, they didn't like the Rebbe's father's religious views, but they loved him as an individual. He was just, as people say, he was just a real, genuine individual, the warmest person who just loved people. So everybody got along with him. And being that he served as rabbi from 1909 until he was arrested in 1930, must have been 1938 or 19 or so on, or maybe a few years earlier than that, because he went from it was 32 years. So 1937, whatever it was. Does that make sense? No, but whatever. I'm not going to do the numbers. But anyway, he was 36 years. The last 18 years as the chief rabbi, and so he's through the First World War. He's the rabbi, the Bolshevik Revolution, through Stalin. It's very interesting times for the Jewish people, and he is a man who's fearless and never wavers his commitment to Judaism. So he remains strong throughout. His influence through that time and his accomplishments, really through the couple stories that we'll share tonight, you'll see the impact that he had on the government, on people around him. And so I believe we're going to go through the 3 videos. 2 of them are stories. One of them is just a little bit about his arrest. And then I'm going to actually share with you some of his, the ways he studied, which were fascinating, just like a little drop in the ocean, a little taste of some of his insight and his style of Torah study. So this is the city of Yekaterinslav. You see, it's a major city. Still today, it's a huge city again in Ukraine.
Как уже я рассказал в прошлый раз, что случилось с моим отцом, что он был раввином в УССР и главным раввином в городе Днепропетровске, который был одним из главных городов всей Украины, который поставляла зерно, пшеницу для большой части России, и когда приходило время приготовить муку для мацы, приезжали со всей УССР на Украину закупать пшеницу. И так как в этом нуждались для Пасхи, то они хотели иметь гехшер, удостоверение от главного раввина, что это кошерно для Пасхи. Когда пришли к нему и сказали обо всем этом, так отец ответил, что он с большой радостью возьмет на себя эту обязанность, но с одним условием, которое само собой понятно, что если он даст удостоверение, что это кошерно для Песах, он должен быть убежден через то, что он поставит своих машгихим, и они будут наблюдать, что пшеницу, которая будет перемелена на муку, кошерная, без воды, и также весь перемол, меление муки будет также без воды. И что тогда, когда не примешивает воду, тогда получается меньше муки, и получается более комплицировано, и это связано с большими расходами. Тогда к нему пришли от управления губернии города, где он был главным раввином, и сказали, что он саботажник и хочет ввести правительство в дефицит, чтобы они истратили много тысяч рублей для того, чтобы это было кошерное. Так он им ответил, что согласно Конституции и согласно его совести, и согласно совести каждого нормального человека, если он дает удостоверение, что это кошерно, он должен быть убежден в этом. И никто не может его заставить, чтобы он писал то, что против его совести, что не правда, 100% ложь. Тогда ему предложили, чтобы он поехал в Москву, и там говорил с президентом Калининым, который был тогда, или с его представителем, и ему изложил все его соображения, что, несмотря на то, что это обойдется мельницам, которые все были под правительственным управлением, обойдется им в сотни тысяч рублей, так нельзя заставить еврея, чтобы он ел мацу, которая не кошерна, и обмануть его. Говорят, что правительство говорит, что это нужно солгать и сказать, что это кошерно, хотя они знают, что это не кошерно. И когда он изложил все эти доводы в Москве, он получил официальное разрешение. И не только разрешение, но было также указание по всей Украине, что во всех тех местах, которые раввин Шнеерсон пошлет своих представителей, дать удостоверение, что это кошерная мука. Им все содействовали и помогали, даже если это будет связано с расходами, и не с там расходами, но с большими расходами. И так это было сделано и проведено по всей Украине. И, как я сказал прежде, что это еще одно доказательство, что когда доводит положение, описывает, как оно в действительности, что еврей хочет воспитывать своих детей согласно его убеждениям, и что он хочет соблюдать субботу и соблюдать Пасху как следует, тогда, если только обращаются к настоящим властям там, они не только не препятствуют, но указывают милиции и всем властям по местам, чтобы они не только не мешали, но охраняли, чтобы другие не мешали евреям вести ежедневную жизнь по-еврейски.
So to stand up to the Russian government when they want you to do one thing very clearly and you do something else, it's sacrifice. But he knew that if he has a choice between doing something that is right or not, he chose the right thing to do, even though it put him in danger. And many other times also, I mean, he was put into situations where it was a question if they didn't like what he had to say. As we know, at the end of his life, he ended up in exile as a punishment for his activities. There was a time that the Rebbe's father went to Kharkov. Kharkov is also a very large city. And when the Rebbe's father went to Kharkov, he went there because there was a meeting that was going on. And there was some kind of statement. I'm trying to remember what exactly what it was, but there was a chance that if the Rebbe's father would sign this statement, then there was a chance that the Russians would lower perhaps or ease up a little bit the way they were treating the Jewish communities. However, the Rebbe's father was very concerned. Why? Because if the Russians eased up the way they treated the Jewish communities, it wouldn't mean that the Jewish people would now be free to do whatever they wanted. It just means that they would leave them, they wouldn't be as strict. They would ease them up a little bit. Now, seems like a very good thing. At least they could ease it up a little bit. However, the Rebbe's father looked at the bigger picture, and I think this is another example where we see how the Rebbe learned a lot of times people would come to the Rebbe with a request, focusing on one small community, and they didn't see the larger picture, and the Rebbe was able to see a much larger picture and the effects that it would have on a much larger scale. And in this particular situation, when the Rebbe's father was in Kharkov and had to sign this particular statement, he was thinking that if Russia, and if it would become known that the Russians would ease up the way they were treating the Jewish community, then outside of Russia, they would then not work as hard or not feel the pressure to push Russia to stop treating the Jewish people the way they were treating them. So perhaps they would ease it up a little bit, but it would be a short-term solution. And from a more global perspective, it could continue to be a challenge, and it wouldn't give the opportunity to the rest of the world to put pressure again on Russia. And so he was stuck between this decision: do I sign it and at least give the Jewish communities in Russia a little freedom now, or do I leave it so that others can put on pressure and get rid of the challenges completely? And he was going back and forth with this. And at that time, so in Kharkov, there was a yeshiva there. And one of the students in the yeshiva, his name was Reb Nachum Goldschmidt. Reb Nachum Goldschmidt was a childhood friend of the Rebbe. So this is one of, a family friend. They were very, very close. And he knew that the Rebbe's father was in the city. So he came to see the Rebbe's father, and he saw the Rebbe's father was having this challenge. And then the Rebbe's father said, that's it. No one will intimidate me. I'm not signing this, because I believe that there are greater effects and consequences to my actions if I sign it, and I'm not going to fall to pressure. And that was the Rebbe's father. It was tremendous. I mean, imagine he's signing something, he's being asked to sign something on behalf of the entire Jewish community. The amount of during the times that he lived, it was just, we can't even imagine the kind of pressure that he might have been going through. And that resolve to say, no one's going to put pressure on me if I feel that something's right, I'm going to go through it, and I'm not going to be intimidated. Unfortunately, some years later, because he stood against the Russian government, he was arrested and imprisoned. We will watch another video.
March 28th, 1939, 3 a.m.
Right.
4 NKVD agents enter Rabbi Levi Yitzchak and Chana Schneerson's home in Yekaterinoslav, a bustling industrial city in south-central Ukraine, brandishing a warrant for search and arrest. His crime? The bolstering of Judaism in the Soviet Union. In 1909, when Rabbi Levi Yitzchak arrived in Yekaterinoslav to assume the position of chief rabbi, he charmed the cosmopolitan population with his commitment to tradition and scholarly brilliance on the one hand, and his sophistication and warmth on the other. But his refusal to bend before the dictates of the new regime cost him his freedom and his life. For 5 years, he languished in exile in the inhospitable village of Chyli, Kazakhstan. Weakened and ill upon his release, he returned his soul to his maker in Almaty, Kazakhstan, on the 20th of Av, 1944. Through all this deprivation, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak found solace in one place: his writing. His pages seethed with erudition, creativity, and improbable intersections between the mystical and legal realms of Torah. Yet his writing is not just an intellectual triumph. It is also a triumph of the spirit. In exile, bereft of conventional paper and ink, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak crammed his notes in the margins of his books, using ink that his wife made from locally grown berries. Tragically, most of his manuscripts were lost during those tumultuous years. Whatever was salvaged was brought to Rabbi Levi Yitzchak's son, the Rebbe in New York. These surviving works were published as a 5-volume set entitled Likutei Levi Yitzchak.
So I have that set of Likutei Levi Yitzchak, of the Rebbe's father's works, very deep Kabbalistic works. I just got a new set of books that came out, 5 volumes, which are the Rebbe's talks explaining his father's works on Kabbalah. Now, before we go into any other stories about his life, I want to talk a little bit about his Torah, his teachings, which were really, really something special, something unique. We're taught that there are 4 ways of understanding, extracting ideas from the Torah. And they are found in the word pardes. Pardes are 4 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, Pei Resh Dalet Samach, which pardes actually means in English, it's a translation of the word pardes, is the orchard. So it's the orchard of the Torah. The Pei stands for Pshat, which is the simple, literal meaning of the Torah, not simple as in a simple meaning, but the literal meaning of the Torah. Remez is the allusions, hints, and the drash, which is interceptions, and so on. And then you have sod, which is the mystical, esoteric meaning of the text. So when you study Kabbalah, generally is the mystical. If you're going to study Chumash, the Torah, the text of the Torah, together with Rashi, which is the basic commentary, Rashi tries to keep it simple, but sometimes he'll include Remez, Drash. If you go into Medrash, you go into the Gemara, the Talmud, there you're going to find, and in other works, you're going to find Remez and Drash, the other 2 ways of studying from the words of the Torah. The Rebbe's father loved to study from the Sod, from the mystical. He was known as a mystic, a Kabbalist, and all of his works were based on Kabbalistic ideas, really getting into the words and letters of the Torah and understanding them from a whole new dimension, bringing light to the Torah like a brand new, like turning on a brand new light that you've never seen before. Just incredible. And that's what he spent his life doing. They often, sometimes he would speak on Shabbos in shul, people wouldn't understand what he was talking about. I hope that doesn't happen when I speak in shul on Shabbos. But I'm not the Rebbe's father. Sometimes he would speak things that people just didn't understand. So they say, "Who are you talking to? We don't know what you're talking. We don't know. We don't understand what you're speaking about." There were times where he gave speeches which were really down to earth, but in general, that was his favorite part of Torah, was the Sod, the mystical. And when they asked him, "So who exactly do you think you're speaking to?" He said, "There's a little boy in the back of the room. He understands what I'm talking about." That was his son. So the Rebbe, of course, understood the insights, the mystical stuff that he would teach. So let's look at one area. This is just an example where you could see in the word Shema, which is the Hero Israel, the most famous verse of the Torah that we all know, Shema Yisrael. So if you want to look at the simple, literal, Shema means to listen. Hero Israel. If you go into the Remez, so you take the letters Shin, Mem, Ayin, and that's lift up your eyes. So Umarom Enechem, lift up your eyes. So you should look up to Hashem and recognize the Creator. So that's the remez. So that's a deeper level of understanding the word hero Israel. Then you have the drash, which is that we learn that you don't have to only say the Shema in Hebrew, but you could also say it in other languages. And you can learn that because Shema means to listen, which means any language that you understand. So that's another way, that's a deeper understanding of the word Shema. And then we could take the word Shema, and there's the letter Shin and Mem, which is already the mystical, and I'm not going to get into it, but basically Sham can mean there, which means from distance, and that the world right now looks like it's distant, but shame could also mean name. And so we transform the Sham, the world, which is distant from God, into shame, into the name of God, revealing God's godliness in this world. And the ayin represents 7 times 7 of the whatever Kabbalistic stuff that I don't even want to get into, but it's to do with the emotions, 7 emotions times 10, which is 70. But this is not a class on Shema, but this is just an example of the 4 different levels of Torah. So we're going to go into the 4th level, but this is interesting because this particular teaching of the Rebbe's father was a teaching that he taught when they got word that he was going to be arrested. So you think, like, what's going through his mind? This man's a Kabbalist. His mind is, he knows what's going on. He's also he knows he's a down-to-earth person. He's a relatable person, and people knew that. But where was he really? Where was his essence? It was in the Kabbalah. And so immediately he tried to find teachings from the Kabbalah to help him and give him direction. So these are words that he taught right before he was arrested. The first letter of the Torah is the letter Bet, and you may have known that. The first word of the Torah is Bereshit, and the first letter of the Hebrew of the word Bereshit is Bet. The last letter of the Torah is Lamed. The last word of the Torah is Yisrael, the Jewish people. Leinei b'nei Yisrael. So Israel, and the last letter of the word Yisrael is Lamed. So you have the first letter of the Torah is Bet. You have the last letter of the Torah is Lamed. Now we know on Simchas Torah, when we try to connect those 2 letters, which is why as soon as we finish reading the cycle of the Torah and Simchas Torah, we don't wait till the next week to start reading the first portion, but we immediately start and connect the 2. Which means that by doing that, what we do is we connect the letter Lamed, which is the last letter, and the first letter of the Torah, which is the letter Bet. And the Rebbe's father writes that these 2 letters spell the Hebrew words Lev, which means heart, and Baal, which means don't. So if you take the letters Bet and Lamed, so if you have it in order, Bet and then Lamed, so then you have Baal, which means do not. If you have it Lamed and Bet in the other order, then you have Lev, which means heart. So these 2 letters remind us, tell us about a heart, and it also tells us about something that we shouldn't do. So the Rebbe's father says that this alludes to the following. This is the last teaching that he taught before he went off to exile. That this alludes to the following. The Torah must be fulfilled with a complete heart and with restraint. So the heart is the lev, and the restraint is the things that you shouldn't do. Now, where does he get this from? How does he understand this? So these are the 2 verses of the Torah, the first and last verse. So you could see in the color the Bet and the Lamed, which makes the word Lev, heart or Baal. So if you take the Bet and the Lamed, you've got Baal, which means don't. You've got Lev, for those who know the Hebrew. So here you have Bet and then Lamed, so that's Baal. Here you have Lamed and then Bet, so that's Lev, which is heart. If you want to serve God with all your heart, be careful. Don't make the following mistakes. Now, what are the mistakes that you shouldn't make? What shouldn't you do? So he says, you want to know what you shouldn't do? There's another verse that tells you what you shouldn't do. And if you go to the Torah says in Deuteronomy, or shamartem la'asot, be careful to do, ka'asher tzivah Hashem Elokeichem, precisely as God, the Lord your God, has commanded you. Lo tasuru, do not veer, yamin, to the right, usmol, and to the left. So the Torah tells us that you should never veer to the right or to the left. What does that mean? So the Rebbe's father says, if you go to the letters Lamed and Bet, here's all the alphabet. Starting from here, we have the Aleph, the Bet, the Gimel. This is Bet and Bet. Gimel, Dalet, Hey, all the way till Taf. So what does it mean not to go to veer right or left? So he says, very simple. Well, in Kabbalistic terms, this is very simple. Going to the right would mean that when you're supposed to focus on this letter, for example, instead of focusing on this letter, you go to this letter. That would be veering to the right. If instead of going to the Bet, you go to the Gimel, then you'd be veering to the left. So that's how he understands this verse. A deeper dimension. Obviously, it always means it's simple meaning, but he also understood that it means don't veer. When the Torah gives you a letter, don't veer to the right and don't veer to the left. So if you look at the word Lev or the word Baal, those letters, it tells you like this. Which two letters do we have? So we have Lamed and Bet. So the Torah says, do not veer to the right and to the left, which means when the Torah says Lev or Baal, don't go to the Aleph, don't go to the Gimel, don't go to the Chaf, don't go to the Mem. Don't veer to the right and don't veer to the left. Now, if you look at the right of the Bet and the Lamed, there's an Aleph and a Chaf. Aleph and Chaf in Hebrew means Ach. However, the Gimel and the Mem over here on the left means Gam also. So he said, if I want to get direction from the Torah about how to behave, the Torah says don't veer to the right and to the left. Don't veer to the right, and say to myself, however, yes, I'm supposed to serve God. Yes, I need to do certain things and I need to observe the Shabbos and I need to eat kosher, but I'm going into a situation where it's going to be extremely difficult. So in such a situation, however, in this situation, I'm going to take it a little easy so that I don't put myself through such a difficult time. No. He says the Torah tells us that we shouldn't veer to the right or to the left. And therefore, I gotta stay grounded. I gotta stay on the letter Lamed and Bet. I can't move here and say to myself, well, I'm gonna move a little bit to the right and tell myself, well, it's only for now because of the situation I'm in. Likewise, don't move to the left, which is Gam, which means also. Yeah, I'm observant, but I'll also add this. It's not such a big deal if I do this once. If I also, in addition to my piety, I'll also do this, and I'll also add something that I shouldn't, that shouldn't be added. I got to do exactly as God wants. And with that kind of attitude, the Rebbe's father goes into 5 years or so of tremendous pain and suffering in the hands of the Russians. But knowing that I've got to stand strong for myself, for my community, and do, in order to have a heart and in order to serve Hashem with passion and with sincerity and a complete relationship with Hashem, that it should be with all my heart. If I want it to be with all my heart, that's the way I got to do it. To stay grounded, to stay on the Lamed and the Bet, to stay on the heart, and not to veer to the right and to the left. And that was his guidance that he gave from a Kabbalistic way of understanding these verses and letters in the Torah, that is how he inspired himself, so to speak, and gave direction in order to move and to go into the place that he was going into, which was a very, very difficult place. So we know that he served Hashem even in the most difficult of circumstances. He served God with a sincere heart, doing that which, and even the story that we spoke about before about the matzah that the Rebbe told before, and by the way, in Russian, that of the matzah, he had the opportunity to, veer a little bit. He didn't have to be so strict and get himself in trouble, right? But he said, no, if I'm a Jew who's sincere about my relationship with Hashem and the heart of my relationship with Hashem, then I can never veer to the right or to the left. I can't just say, I'll give a little lie, or let them do what they want to do. If people are relying on me to eat kosher, I got to make sure that the matzahs are 100% kosher without veering to the right or to the left. And that was something that he learned. There are many. I mean, again, I was sitting last year, tonight, last night, I forget what it was, whatever, one of the nights, either the night before, the night after, in London. I went to visit my parents last summer with the family to celebrate my father's 70th birthday. And I'm glad I went, because I don't know when the next time I'm going to be able to fly there is, but we went there as a family, which was really nice. And I came to the Farbrengen, which was always, I was looking forward to sit and at this gathering where they gathered together for the Rebbe's father's yahrzeit, not realizing that they had a nice young rabbi guest, and that they would ask me to speak, which I don't remember what I said. I told them I'll speak for a few minutes, but I was exhausted. Actually, my family had flown into England the night before. I was scheduled to go in the night before, and then someone's father, who I was very close to, passed away, and I pushed off my flight a day to be able to do the funeral. So I was exhausted. So I have no recollection of what I might have spoken about that evening, but I know that I sat there and they asked me to say a few words. So I said a few words. And I remember they were discussing one of his talks, and someone was explaining one of his deep Kabbalistic talks, and it was fascinating. So the Rebbe's father was an incredible person. We're going to see a personal story that someone shares about the Rebbe's father at this time. Oh, I'm still here with the letters, which I already explained. So we'll just move on to this.
Mr. Israel Adamski lived in Dnepropetrovsk, Ukraine. In the 1930s, he attended underground Torah classes taught by the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi Yitzhak Schneerson.
Семья Рава, вся семья жила на втором этаже. Первый этаж был такой полуподвальный, второй этаж они занимали. А на третьем этаже жил человек, который был управляющим этого дома, коммунист, еврей, но который, между прочим, на которого возлагалось следить за Равом. Следить и докладывать вышестоящие органы. Короче говоря, вот он такую роль играл. И вот однажды было такое вот дело. Значит, в семью Рава пришла женщина и сказала, что я хочу, чтобы моя дочка вышла замуж, значит, чтобы у нее была свадьба только по-еврейски. Чтобы была хупа, чтобы все как полагается было. Ну, Рав говорит, давайте ее сюда. Привели ее и тут же поставили хупу. Но нужны были свидетели. Кто-то, нужно были еще люди. Так? Людей не хватало, и тогда Рав говорит, я знаю, кого пригласить. давайте пригласим вот этого самого Хаима, который живет. Ну, все удивились, потому что знали, что Хаим ведет себя не так, как прилично, неприлично. Он говорит, давайте его позовем. Его позвали. Он принимал участие в этой свадьбе. Потом Рав с ним говорил, беседовал. И он ему признался. Рав и так знал. Он ему признался, что он вот, за ним следит и так далее. Он коммунист. И в следующую субботу он пришел в синагогу. Это было тогда, когда синагог уже было очень мало. На весь город 2. Одна помещалась на улице Фрунзенской, а другая, там дальше Литейная такая улица была в центре. Там помещалась. И все прихожане синагоги знали так друг друга. И вдруг среди них появился вот этот человек. И он сказал очень громко, прошу меня не бояться. Я такой же еврей, как вы. Ихбенаид. Этот коммунист потом стал активистом. Активистом, ну, знаете, активистом за то, чтобы еврей остался евреем. Понимаете?
So we see the Rebbe's style of encouraging people and getting involved. In fact, after the Rebbe's father became very sick, and fortunately, I believe he might have had cancer, but no one knows exactly. It seems his body was shutting down and was very, very sick, and there wasn't treatments that he was able to have or anything there where he was. He went to live in that in that community, the small community of where there were some, a few Chabad, 1 or 2 Chabad families that were there, I believe, in that community. Most Chabad, the large Chabad community during that time was in Samarkand. And the Rebbe's father was there. And again, there were a number of people who were with him right before he passed away, including one I grew up with that would always Fabren with us. He didn't share that much, and it was a very short amount of time. He didn't know him from when he was younger, but he felt that connection. And so I've always felt that connection as well. I want to finish off with, first of all, the Rebbe continued to, after the Rebbe's father passed away, his mother eventually went to France I think it was 1947. The Rebbe flew from New York, took a boat from New York traveled from New York back to France to greet his mother and bring his mother back to America, where she lived from 1947 until 1965. She was able to watch her son become Rebbe in 1950 and 1951, where he officially took it on. And for 15 years, she was able to enjoy that nachas of seeing her son continue in her husband's footsteps of leading the Jewish community, but taking it a step further, not only one large community, but the world Jewry, as she had the nachas of being able to see. So I want to just say, the Rebbe would bring every year on his father's, make a gathering and speak on his father's yahrzeit. On holidays, especially in Simchas Torah, there was, and the last couple of years, the Rebbe would bring, he would very often begin or ask to begin and to sing his father's Simchas Torah song. It was called the Hakafah song, which is the song he sang when he danced with the Torah on Simchas Torah. And so it's the 1 year Simchas Torah, as I've shared in the past. I was sitting in 770 during the Farbrengen. There weren't many young people during that Farbrengen there at the gathering. And the reason was because many of those, the youngsters would walk to communities around by the Rebbe's, through the Rebbe's encouragement to bring joy of the holiday to communities throughout Brooklyn, Manhattan. They would walk up many, many miles. And it's not for tonight, for the story which I've shared, so some of you have heard how at that time in 1991, I had arthritis in my foot and had a very difficult time walking. And so I was there at the Farbrengen, and I had a very interesting experience, and I only realized halfway through what was really going on. I came into 770 and I figured it didn't look too busy, because most times when the Rebbe Farbrengen came into davening, if you didn't get a place very early, the place packed. There were thousands of people that would come in, and you couldn't move, and you couldn't get a place if you came late. I came in and I was surprised to see that it wasn't that full. Now, obviously, I knew that many people had walked and I had chosen not to. So I figured this would be a good opportunity to get a close spot, because usually as a guest, I didn't really get a close spot. And here's a great opportunity. So I went to the front table right in front of the Rebbe's stage where he sat and conducted this Farbrengen. And that table, there were a bunch of young boys, younger than me, anywhere between the ages of 8 and 15. I was 15, I believe, 14 and 15 at the time. But most of them were younger than me. And they were sitting at this table. So I figured it's a great place to sit amongst these kids. Great spot in front of the Rebbe. I don't know what I was thinking. But slowly, and I'll finish off with this story, slowly, each one left the place, because as I realized, they were saving the spots for their grandfathers. So when the grandfather came, this one got off. The next grandfather came, there were a whole bunch of old men, 80s and 90s, sitting at this table, and there was I, and suddenly I realized that I'm the only one left sitting at this table, but no one told me to get up, so I'm not getting up. So I sat there, and the Rebbe started his Farbrengen, and the Rebbe was speaking, and it was an amazing experience to be able to hear the Rebbe from up close. However, it was after the week of being a guest in a community. You're always tired anyway, especially I grew up in London, so I come from London, and you're on a different time. You're very exhausted. Sukkot is a time where the community in Crown Heights states, especially the yeshiva boys and myself, we stayed up most of the nights and got up early in the morning to do the lulav and run around Manhattan and shake lulav with people. I was exhausted, and I was dozing off during this Farbrengen until I hear the Rebbe's voice in the background, but my eyes are like closing, and I'm hearing the Rebbe, and suddenly I hear the Rebbe say in Yiddish, the Eine von the Nigunim von Simchas Torah, one of the songs of Simchas Torah. And the Rebbe stood up, and as the Rebbe stood up, all these old men stood up together and lifted me up. And I heard the Rebbe's voice, and then the Rebbe started. The Rebbe stood up like this, yada-da, yada-da, yada-da. And he started to clap and sing his father's Hakafis Simchas Torah song, which was a very, very special song, a very joyous song. And the Rebbe sang that song. So I also had that experience of having that connection of hearing the Rebbe sing his father's song on his father's Simchas Torah song on Simchas Torah, which was a very beautiful experience. So I wanted to share that with you. So this is an interesting individual, and we share this on the day of his yahrzeit, as we know that everything that a person learns and did in their lifetime is elevated on the day of their yahrzeit. May this be a day of blessing for his soul, and through his son, who he brought up in a wonderful way. He had another 2 children, another 2 sons. They had 3 boys, one who was killed by the Nazis, and the other one who went to live in Liverpool in England, and had passed away, I believe in the early 60s. But anyway, he taught his son well, And because of him, we are sitting here having this class. So it's a great honor to his soul. So I want to thank everybody for joining us this evening. And